I ruined Easter and I would do it 100 times over. My name is Margot Ellison and I am 38 years old. On the second Sunday of April, I sat at my mother's dining room table surrounded by 14 members of my immediate family. My mother, my brother Collins, my sisters Bree, their spouses, their children's, my aunts, my father's oldest friends who had been coming to this house for Easter since before I was born. And I opened a manila folder in the middle of the ham and the scalloped potatoes and the deviled eggs my mother had made at 5 in the morning, and I put what was inside it on the table where everyone could see. My brother Colin had been stealing from my mother for 22 months, not dramatically, not violently. With a pen and a signature on documents she signed during the 4 weeks, following my father's death, when her grief was so total and so disorienting that she would have signed anything placed in front of her by anyone she trusted, which included her eldest son, who she had trusted completely and without qualification for 42 years because he had never once given her a reason not to. He used a power of attorney she signed to transfer money. He used an account she didn't know about. He used her trust the way people use a tool they didn't build and don't fully understand and aren't careful with. He used it steadily, quietly, in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic flags. For 22 months, while I was the one managing her medical appointments and her household accounts and her medication schedule and the grief that lived in the house on Dunmore Road like a second resident. Across town, Colin was renovating his kitchen. What Colin didn't know, sitting at my mother's Easter table with his wife, Dana, and his 3 sons and his new kitchen already installed and paid for, was that our father had made a phone call to his personal attorney 14 days before the diagnosis that changed everything. That the attorney, a woman named Patricia Hale, had been holding a specific set of instructions for 26 months, waiting for the conditions that would make delivering them necessary. That 3 weeks before Easter, those conditions had been met, and that the person our father had named in those instructions, the person he had told Patricia to call, was me. Before I tell you what was in that folder and what happened when I put on the table, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. I want to know where you're watching from. Now let me take you back 28 years to a Saturday morning in February to my father's study on Dunmore Road and the beginning of the education I didn't know I was receiving. Growing up in Millhaven, there were 3 Ellison children, and my father Frank loved all of us with the particular completeness of a man who had decided early that fatherhood was the most serious undertaking of his life and conducted it accordingly. Colin was the oldest by 4 years, Bree was youngest by 3. I was the middle, which is a position that teaches you things about invisibility that you cannot learn any other way. Colin was my father's firstborn and carried that in the way firstborns do, with an easy authority that he had never had to earn because it came with the order of arrival. He was confident and sociable and good-looking in the uncomplicated way of men who have always been well-received, and my parents loved him the way you love a thing that turns out exactly as you hoped, with relief and vindication mixed into the pride. He ran the offensive line in high school. He knew the names of everyone in town. He could walk into any room and within 20 minutes be the person other people were orienting toward. My father admired this in Colin. My mother adored it. I observed it the way I observed most things about my brother, which was carefully and from a slight distance that I had learned was the correct vantage point. Bree was youngest and received the specific tenderness reserved for youngest children in families where the parents understood, somewhere in the second half of the parenting years, that this was the last time they would do this. She was softer than Colin and gentler than me and had a way of being cared for that was not manipulation and not passivity, but something more like a natural quality, the way certain plants turn toward light without deciding to. She was loved easily. I did not hold this against her. She couldn't help what she was any more than I could help what I was, which was the middle child who did not generate the same quality of parental attention and had therefore developed other resources. My father Frank owned and operated Ellison Accounting, a small firm on Pine Street that served local businesses, contractors, and individuals who needed their taxes done correctly and their finances understood clearly. He had built it from a single-room office with 1 bookkeeper in 1983 to a 12-person operation by the time I was in high school, and he ran it with the same organized attention he brought to everything. Precisely, without waste, with a genuine belief that understanding a person's financial situations honestly was one of the more useful things you could do for them. He was the parent who saw me most clearly, not because my mother didn't love me or wasn't paying attention, but because there was something specific in the way his mind worked that matched something specific in the way my mind worked. And that matching created a frequency between us that felt like recognition even when I was too young to name what was being recognized. We were both watchers, both interested in how things actually operated rather than how they appeared to operate, both more comfortable with the truth of a situation than with a comfortable version of it. He started bringing me to the office on Saturdays when I was 10, not to be helpful, to learn. He gave me tasks that were calibrated precisely to my current understanding and then calibrated upward when I had mastered them, the same way a good teacher advances a student, which he was, though he would not have used that word. I learned to reconcile accounts when I was 11. I understood double entry bookkeeping before I started high school. I could read a profit and loss statement and tell you what it meant about the decisions the business had been making by the time I was 15. He kept his records in ledger books. Not software, not spreadsheets, ledger books, physical, green-covered, organized by year. He had kept them since 1979, and they lived on a specific shelf in his study in a specific order, and if you took one out and put it back incorrectly, he noticed within 24 hours. He showed me how to use them when I was 12, walking me through the columns with a mechanical pencil, explaining not just what each entry meant, but why the entry existed, and what decision it documented, and what you could understand about a period of time from reading its ledger carefully. A ledger, he said once, is not a record of money. It's a record of decisions. Every number in it is a choice someone made. If you can read the choices, you understand what actually happened. Not the story someone tells about what happened, what actually happened. I thought about that sentence many times in the 22 months after he died. I thought about it specifically on the morning I sat in Patricia Hale's office and read the statements she put in front of me understood, from reading the numbers, exactly what choice my brother had been making and how long he had been making it. My mother, June, ran the household and volunteered at the public library on Tuesdays and Thursdays and made the kind of food that people describe as the way things should taste. And she loved her children with a warmth that was genuine and complete, and that had never been required to be strategic because she had never imagined a situation in which strategy would be necessary. She was trusting in the specific way of people who have never been given a significant reason not to trust, which is a beautiful way to move through the world, and a quality that can be exploited by someone who understands it and has decided to. Colin understood it. I don't know when he decided to. I graduated high school and went to the State University, accounting, because it was the subject in which I had the most prior fluency, and because it suited a mind that finds precision satisfying rather than tedious. I was not a spectacular student in the sense of being remarkable. I was a thorough one. I did the work carefully and completely, and asked questions when something wasn't clear and built a foundation that would hold weight later. My father came to my graduation. My mother wore the yellow dress she wore to important events. Colin came and brought a girlfriend none of us had met before who he was no longer seeing 2 months later. I passed my CPA exam at 24. I was hired by a regional firm in the city, audit and forensic accounting. The part of the work that involves determining what actually happened in a financial situation versus what someone claims happened, which requires the same quality of attention my father had been training in me since I was 10 years old in his office on Saturday mornings. I was good at it in the way that signals that a person has found the work they were made for, efficiently, with genuine interest, with a capacity to hold detail and pattern simultaneously that my supervisors noticed and named within my first year. I want to tell you something about forensics accounting, because it matters to what happened at Easter. People think forensic accounting is about finding dramatic crimes, large-scale frauds, spectacular collapses. Sometimes it is. More often, it is about reading a ledger the way my father taught me to read a ledger, looking for the choices, understanding the pattern of decisions, finding the place where what actually happened diverges from the story being told about it. The divergence is almost never explosive. It is usually quiet. It usually looks at first like a clerical error or an administrative overlap or a misunderstanding that a reasonable person could explain. You keep reading. The pattern clarifies. The divergence gets wider, and at some point you are no longer looking at an error. You are looking at a choice someone made, repeated, over time in amounts calibrated to avoid notice. I was 34 when my father was diagnosed. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, discovered in October when he had gone to his GP about what he described as persistent indigestion and what his GP correctly identified as something requiring immediate further investigation. He called me first, not Colin, me. I don't know if this was because he understood that I would respond practically rather than emotionally, or because he wanted to have the conversation once with someone who wouldn't require management before he had the broader family conversation, or because I was the one whose number was first in his phone under recent calls because we talked twice a week on Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings, which was a habit we had maintained since I moved to the city and which neither of us had ever discussed discontinuing. He said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to listen without reacting until I've finished." I said, "Okay," he told me. I listened. I did not react until he had finished, which took 7 minutes. And when he finished, I asked 3 practical questions about the diagnosis and the treatment plan and the timeline, which was what he needed and what he had called me for. He said after, "Your mother is going to need a lot of support through this." I said, "I know." He said, "Colin will mean well." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I had known Colin for 34 years, and I understood everything that was contained in those 3 words. Colin would mean well. He would also be distracted by his business, intermittently present, emotionally useful in the ways that are visible and publicly legible, and unreliable in the precise and sustained administrative ways that a serious illness listed requires. This was not malice. It was character. Colin had never been required to be precise and sustained, because his way of being in the world had always been rewarded without those qualities. That changes a person over time, slowly, in ways they don't notice. I drove home on weekends. I managed the communication with the oncology team. I built a system for tracking his medications and his appointments and the rotating schedule of family visits that needed coordination, and I ran that system for 11 months without being asked to and without describing what I was doing as anything other than what any daughter would do for her father, which is what I believed it was and what it was. Colin came when he could. He was warm and funny in the hospital room and held my father's hand and made my mother laugh and said the right things. He came to 8 of the 23 appointments I tracked in the spreadsheet I kept on my laptop. He meant well. This is true and I hold it as true. He meant well, and he understood his own meaning well as the complete picture, which it was not. Bree came when she could from 3 states away. She was limited by distance in ways that were real, and I did not hold them against her. She called my mother every evening for the last 4 months, which was a genuine contribution and one I noted. My father died on a February morning with the particular stillness of winter outside his bedroom window, and my mother and me in the room and Colin and Bree on their way, but not arrived yet. He had been declining for 3 weeks in the way the doctors had described, and I had tracked in the careful log I kept, not because I needed a record, but because my mind required somewhere to put the information that was too difficult to simply hold. He died quietly, between one breath and the next, without drama, in the specific way of a man who had conducted his entire life without drama. I held my mother's hand. I called Colin, I called Bree, I called the hospice nurse. I sat in the kitchen and made coffee for no one, and looked at the February light on the back garden, which was bare and gray and very still, and I thought about the ledger books on the shelf in his study, and whether he would want me to keep them, or whether they were just record-keeping, and records had simply ended and I didn't know the answers, and I sat with not knowing it. My father's estate went to probate in March. He had a will, organized and clear, the way everything of his was organized and clear. The house and its contents to my mother. His personal accounts divided among the 3 children, 1/3 each, after my mother's expenses were provided for. The business to be dissolved or sold. Per my mother's preference, she chose dissolution, which was her right and her decision. The life insurance policy also divided. Everything documented, witnessed, notarized, executed. The will was not the problem. The will was exactly what it was supposed to be. The problem was the power of attorney. My mother had signed a general power of attorney in the weeks immediately following my father's death, in the period I now understand, professionally and personally, as the acute grief window, the 4 to 6 weeks after a significant loss, when a person's executive functions is genuinely impaired, in ways that feel from inside like functioning, but produce decisions that the same person would not make with a clear mind. She had signed it because Colin had suggested it. He had presented it as practical, as something that would allow him to help her manage the transition, to handle paperwork on her behalf, to deal with institutions and accounts, and the administrative burden of becoming a widow without requiring her to engage with every document personally during the most difficult period of her life. She had trusted him, completely and without qualification. For 42 years, she had not been given a reason not to. He was not wrong that a POA was a useful instrument for the administrative transition. He was wrong about everything else he used it for. I want to pause here for a moment. If you are listening to this and you have a parent who is widowed or aging, or in a position where someone else is helping manage their finances, I want you to hear me. Look at the accounts. Not out of suspicion, not because your family is necessarily doing anything wrong. Look at them because looking at them is the thing a person does when they understand that love is not a substitute for attention. Drop something in the comments if you know what I mean by that. I want to know you're there. I did not look at the accounts for 20 months. This is the part of the story I have had to be honest with myself about. I drove home every 3rd weekend. I managed the medical appointments, the household maintenance questions, the insurance paperwork, the ongoing administrative life of a widow in her first year alone. I did not look at the financial accounts because Colin had the POA and had presented himself as handling it, and because I trusted that handling it meant what it said. Because he was my brother, and I had known him for 38 years, and because I was not in the habit, in my personal life, of applying the same forensic attention I applied professionally to my own family. Because some part of me believed that forensic attention was for situations where fraud was a real possibility, and in my own family, fraud was not a real possibility. I was wrong, not about my family's character in general, about one specific person's character in one specific situation under one specific set of pressures I had not anticipated. The attorney called on a Thursday evening in March, 3 weeks before Easter. I was in my apartment making dinner. The number was local, Millhaven area code, and I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize it, and I had been fielding insurance calls for 2 years and had developed a mild aversion to unknown local numbers. I answered. She said, "Miss Ellison, my name is Patricia Hale. I was your father's personal attorney. I'm calling because I have something for you, and the timing for delivering it has arrived." I set down the spatula. I turned off the burner. I sat down at my kitchen table, she explained. My father had called her 14 days before his diagnosis, which I understood to mean he had gone to his GP about the persistent indigestion and had known, in the way some people know before the knowledge becomes official, that what was coming was serious. He had made a phone call to Patricia and he had given her 2 things, a letter in a sealed envelope addressed to me and a set of instructions. The instructions were, if suspicious financial activity is identified on June Ellison's accounts within 5 years of Frank Ellison's death, contact Margot Ellison immediately. Do not contact Colin. Do not contact Bree unless Margot requests it. Contact Margot. Patricia had been monitoring, not intrusively, not illegally, with a read-only access arrangement to my mother's primary accounts that my father had established with my mother's knowing and documented consent before his death. One of the 27 things he had organized in the months between receiving the diagnosis and dying, because he was Frank Ellison and he organized things. The suspicious activity threshold had been crossed 8 weeks ago. Patricia had taken 3 weeks to compile the documentation before calling me, which I respected professionally and understood personally. She was not calling me with a suspicion. She was calling me with a file. I drove to Millhaven on Saturday morning. Patricia's office was on Birch Street, above the pharmacy, a small, clean office with filing cabinets along one wall and a window facing the street, and the particular organized quality of a space maintained by someone who takes their work seriously. She was in her early 60s, silver-haired, with reading glasses she wore on her face rather than on her head, and a way of presenting difficult information that was direct without being harsh, which I recognized as the manner of someone who has delivered difficult information many times and has learned that the kindest version is the honest one. She put the file on the desk between us. She said, "I want you to look through this before I explain anything. I want you to see it yourself." I understood why she said this. She was giving me the experience of reading it, not the experience of being told about it. She was trusting my professional capacity. I nodded. I read for 22 minutes. The accounts my father had established jointly with my mother for household expenses. The account in my mother's name that had been her personal account for 16 years. The investment account that had been part of my father's estate transferred to my mother per the will, with my father's explicit written instruction that it was to remain untouched except for my mother's living expenses for a minimum of 3 years while the estate settled. Colin had accessed all three, not chaotically. With the same patient calibration I recognized from my professional work. Transfers of $3,000 or $4,000, never crossing the $5,000 threshold that would trigger automatic reporting requirements. Spaced 12 to 18 days apart, often preceded by a small legitimate transaction, a utility payment made on my mother's behalf, a grocery store run that established a pattern of normal activity around which the anomalous activity was embedded. 71 transactions over 22 months, total withdrawn, $187,400. I sat with the number. $180,400. I said to Patricia, "Does he know you've been monitoring?" She said no. I said, "Does my mother know what she signed gave him this access?" Patricia paused. Then, I believe she understood she was signed something that allowed him to help with paperwork. I don't believe she understood the full scope of the instrument. I said, "Has anyone else seen this?" She said, "Only me, and now you." I said, "What are my options?" She laid them out the way my father would have laid them out, methodically, without drama. Report it to Adult Protective Services, which would initiate an investigation. Engage a civil attorney for recovery action. Confront Colin directly, which she did not recommend without legal counsel present. Do nothing, which was an option she named without judgment, because all options needed to be named. I said, "I need to see my mother's current understanding of her financial situation." She said, "I thought you would." She slid a second folder across the desk. "I've prepared a summary." I read the summary. My mother believed she had significantly more than she had. She had been told by Colin in at least 2 documented phone conversations Patricia had noted references to in the account logs that her accounts were fine, that he was managing things well, that she didn't need to worry. She was not fine. She was not at a crisis point. The investment account was largely intact because Patricia had flagged the anomalous access pattern before it progressed further, but she was $187,400 less than she believed herself to be, and she was 68 years old and widowed, and the difference mattered. Patricia said, "Your father wanted you to have this." She handed me the sealed envelope. I sat in the chair and held it for a moment. It was a regular business envelope, sealed, with my name on the front in my father's handwriting. His mechanical pencil print, the same handwriting I had watched fill ledger books for 28 years. Margot, just my name. I opened it carefully. It was 1 page. 1 page in his handwriting, blue ink, dated 2 days after the conversation with Patricia. He wrote the way he talked, directly, without unnecessary length. He wrote, "If you're reading this, Pat has found something that needed finding. I'm sorry you're dealing with this. I want you to know I didn't know, I suspected, which is different. I suspected because I know Colin loves your mother and would not intentionally hurt her, while also being capable of convincing himself that what he needed was reasonable and that what was available should be available to him because he is Colin, and things have always been available to Colin, and he has never fully understood why they shouldn't continue to be. I suspected because I also know your mother, and I know what her grief will make her sign without reading. I did not build in protections because I believed him capable of this. I built in protections because I believed myself capable of being wrong." He wrote, "You are the right person for this, not because you are harder than your siblings, because you are precise." Because you learned from me how to read what actually happened. Because I trust your judgment in a room where the truth is uncomfortable. I have always trusted your judgment. He wrote, don't let him make this your fault. The truth is not the problem. The truth is what's true. Deal with it clearly and don't apologize for what dealing with it requires. I put the letter down on Patricia's desk. I was going to need a minute. She waited. She had clearly done this before. The sitting with someone while they absorbed something their father had written before he died. She was patient. She looked at the window. She gave me the room. After a minute, I picked the letter up and folded it precisely along its original creases and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I picked up the file. Then I said, I need to know if my mother has cognitive capacity to be part of this decision. Patricia said, I believe she does. The memory issues are early stage and situational. She is capable of understanding and making decisions. She has just not been given the correct information to make them from. I said, I'd like to be the one to give her the correct information. Patricia said, I thought you would say that too. I did not go to my mother's house that Saturday. I went home. I sat at my kitchen table and I did what I do when a financial picture is unclear. I made it clear. I built a complete account of what had happened, transaction by transaction, in a spreadsheet that documented the full scope, the amounts, the dates, the pattern, the total. I did it the way I would do it professionally, without emotion, with the complete attention that the work required and that I had been trained to give it. It took 4 hours. Then I made dinner. I called my friend Kay, who I had known since university, and who was the person I called when I needed to think something through out loud, and I told her what I had found. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to tell my mother, and then I'm going to tell Colin. She said, when? I said, Easter is in 3 weeks. The whole family will be there. She said, Margot. I said, I know. She said, are you sure? I said, my father built the monitoring system because he anticipated this. Patricia called me because my father told her to. He wanted me to have the information and he wanted me to use it. The only question I have about Easter is whether it's the right context. Kay said, and? I said, the context is my mother's house, her table, where she has hosted Easter for 40 years, where my father sat for 40 years, which she currently believes is the house of a woman who is financially stable and who is being well managed by the son she trusts completely. Telling her privately is one option. Telling her in a room where Colin is present and the full picture is available is another. He will not have an answer ready. He will not have a story prepared. He will have to sit at her table, at my father's table, and account for what he did. She was quiet. I said, my father said, don't let him make this your fault. Don't apologize for what dealing with it requires. She said, okay. What do you need from me between now and then? I said, nothing yet. I'll call you after. I went to my mother's house on a Wednesday. I told her I was coming for dinner. She made pot roast because I had mentioned once, 3 years ago, that her pot roast was the thing I missed most about Millhaven. And she had not forgotten this because my mother never forgets the things her children love, even when she is grieving, and even when her memory is beginning to do the things that a memory beginning to age does. I sat at the kitchen table in the house on Dunmore Road and ate pot roast, and I talked to her about her life and her friends and the library and the neighbors and everything, except what I had found, because I needed to understand how she was before I changed what she knew. She was managing. That was the word that felt most accurate. She was managing in the effortful way of someone who has organized their days around a loss that has not gotten smaller, only more familiar. She talked about my father the way you talk about someone when you have stopped crying about them and started simply missing them, which is quieter and more permanent and, in its way, harder. She talked about Colin with the uncomplicated warmth of a mother who has not been given any reason to do otherwise. I drove home that night and sat in my car outside my building for 20 minutes. I was not deciding whether to do it. I was preparing for what doing it would cost. Telling my mother was the hardest thing I have done in my adult life, harder than Easter, because Easter was a room full of people who deserved to have the truth said clearly in front of them. Telling my mother was sitting across from a 68-year-old woman who had been widowed for 26 months and who had trusted her eldest son with her financial life, and who was about to understand that the trust had been used as a mechanism. I drove back to Millhaven on a Saturday, 10 days before Easter. I called ahead. I told her I needed to talk about something important. She heard it in my voice and she said, come for lunch. I brought the folder. I brought my spreadsheet, printed. I brought a summary I had written at 1 page in plain language, no jargon, the way my father had taught me to present a financial situation to someone who needed to understand it without needing to become an accountant to do so. I brought coffee from the place on Pine Street she liked. I sat across from her at the kitchen table. I put the summary in front of her. I said, Mom, I need to walk you through something. I need you to read this first and then I'll answer every question you have. She read it. She read it slowly, which was the correct pace, and her face moved through things I watched carefully without narrating. Confusion first, then the specific confusion of a figure that doesn't match what you believe the figure should be, then the beginning of a different kind of understanding, then something that was not yet anger but was the precursor to it, the arrival of a situation that requires a response before you have the response fully formed. She said, how long? I said, 22 months. She said, how much? I said, $187,400. She was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on Dunmore Road. She said, he used the paper I signed. I said, yes. She said, I signed it because he said it would help. I said, I know. She said, I didn't understand what I was signing. I said, I know that too, Mom. That's documented. She looked at me. Her eyes were dry, which I understood was the specific dryness of shock, the moment before the emotion has fully arrived. She said, your father knew. I said, he suspected. He put a monitoring system in place before he died, through Patricia Hale. He left a letter for me. She was quiet again. I said, he named me specifically. He said I was the right person to deal with it. He trusted my judgment. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. She said, of course he did. She picked up the summary again. She read it a second time. Then she put it down and squared it on the table with the precision of a woman who is deciding what she is going to do next rather than what she is going to feel about what has already happened, which is a particular quality I recognized, and which told me that her mind was working clearly, that whatever the early stage memory issues were doing to the edges of her cognition, the center was holding. She said, Easter is in 10 days. I said, yes. She said, Colin will be here. I said, yes. She said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to tell him what I know in front of you. In this house. I want it to be clear and documented and witnessed. I want you to be present. This is your money, Mom. Your house. Your table. You should be there when it's named. She sat with that for a moment. Then what happens to him? I said, that depends on what he does next. There are legal options. Patricia can advise. We don't have to decide that today. We need to decide whether we do this at Easter. My mother looked at the kitchen window. The same window I had looked through on a February morning 2 years ago after my father died. The same back garden, the same bare forsythia that had been there since before I was born, beginning now to show the first pale green of April at its tips. She said, your father built 40 years of Easter at this table. His oldest friends come to this table on Easter Sunday. Ray and Barbara have been coming since 1984. Vivian was there the Easter I was pregnant with Colin. I said, I know. She said, Colin knows that. He has always known the weight of this table. I said nothing. She said, he should account for it here. I said, yes. She said, then we do it at Easter. I want to stop here for a second because I know some of you are sitting with what that conversation cost both of us, and I want to acknowledge it before I keep going. If you have ever had to be the person who brings the truth into a room where the truth is going to hurt someone you love, even though not bringing it would hurt them more, slowly over time, in a way they might never trace back to its source, I want you to drop something in the comments. Because that specific position, the one where telling the truth is an act of love that looks nothing like love from the outside, is one of the loneliest places I know, and I want to know you're there. Now let me tell you about Easter Sunday. My mother hosts Easter the same way she has hosted it for 40 years and the same way her mother hosted it before her. Comprehensively, warmly, starting the day before, with a menu that does not change in its essentials, because the essentials are the point. The honey-glazed ham, the scalloped potatoes with the breadcrumb crust that requires a specific ratio she knows by feel, the deviled eggs she makes at 5 in the morning because they need several hours in the refrigerator, and she has always made them at 5 in the morning and sees no reason to revise a practice that works. The green bean casserole my father had requested every Easter since 1981, and which she continues to make because the tradition outlives the person it was made for, and that is the point of a tradition. I arrived at 9 on Easter morning. My mother was already in the kitchen, moving with the particular organized efficiency of someone who has been running this production for decades and has internalized its sequence completely. She was wearing her apron, a blue canvas one from the kitchen store that she has owned for 20 years and refuses to replace because it works. Her face was composed in the way of a woman who has made a decision and is living inside the decision and will continue to do so until the moment it becomes action. She looked at me when I came in. She said, the folder is in my bedroom on the dresser. I said, I know, I put it there last night. She said, good. I said, how are you? She said, I made the eggs at 5. They need another 4 hours. She turned back to the potatoes. I'm all right, Margot. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at her elbow and stood beside her at the counter, and we worked together for 90 minutes without discussing what was coming, which was not avoidance but preparation. You do not discuss the thing while you are preparing the table for it. You prepare the table. You put out the good china. You make the food your family has made for 40 years. You do the thing correctly up until the moment it becomes something different. That was my mother's approach, and I recognized it as correct. Bree arrived at 11 with her husband James and their daughter Sophie, who was 7 and deeply engaged in the specific project of being 7 at Easter, which involved the basket her grandmother had prepared and the egg hunt in the back garden that had been a feature of Easter on Dunmore Road for 31 years. My mother took Sophie into the back garden immediately. I watched from the kitchen window. My mother crouched beside Sophie in the April garden, pointing at the places where the colored eggs were hidden with the gentle patience of a grandmother who has done this many times and understands that the finding is the point, not the speed of the finding. I thought about my father watching from this window. He would have been at the kitchen table with coffee, watching through the glass with the quiet satisfaction of a man who built something worth watching from a kitchen window. Colin arrived at noon. He drove the new truck he had bought 8 months ago. He came through the front door with his wife Dana and his 3 sons Ethan and Josh and the youngest Caleb, who was 4 and immediately joined Sophie in the back garden at top volume. He smelled like the cedar cologne he had worn since his 20s, and he was wearing a blue button-down, and he had brought a bottle of wine and a store-bought pie, which my mother received with warmth because she always received things with warmth, which he had always relied on. He hugged my mother. He shook James's hand. He said something easy to breathe that made her laugh. He hugged me and said, "Margot, you look good. Driving in okay?" I said, "Fine." He looked at me a half-second longer than the exchange required. Then he moved toward the living room, where my father's oldest friends, Ray and Barbara, were already settled with drinks. I heard him say something to Ray that made Ray laugh. I heard Ray say, "Your dad would love this, wouldn't he?" And Collins said he really would. The meal came together the way it always does, the way 40 years of practice produces, with the specific organized flow of a family that has run the sequence long enough to know where everyone stands and what they do, and when the thing needs to come out of the oven. We ate at 1:30. The table was full in the way it has always been full in this house. 14 people around the table my father had sat at the head of for 40 years, and which my mother now occupied, quietly and without calling attention to the shift. The food was what it always is. People ate well and said so. Colin told a story about a job his company had landed, a significant one, delivered with the easy confidence of a man sharing good news, and the table received it warmly because the table loves Colin, has always loved Colin, because Colin at a table is a performance worth watching, and this table has never had reason to watch it critically. Ray said Frank would have loved to hear that. Colin said he really would have. I was watching my mother's face. She was composed with the absolute precision of a woman who has decided on a course and is holding it. Bree's daughter, Sophie, from the children's end of the table asked, "Grandma, is there more potato?" My mother said, "Of course there is, sweetheart." She passed the dish. She looked at me. The look lasted 1 second. I reached into the chair beside me where I had placed the folder when I sat down. I put it on the table, not dramatically. I set it down the way you set down something that belongs on a surface, flat and clear. Colin saw it first because Colin was the one looking in my direction, telling a follow-up detail of his story to Ray. He stopped, mid-sentence. His eyes went to the folder, then to my face, then back to the folder. The folder was Manila, standard weight, and on its front I had written in my own handwriting, Ellison Estate Accounts, February 2022 to December 2023. The table did not immediately understand what was happening. The table was still in the warm momentum of after lunch, the children at their end, the adults reaching for second servings. It was my mother who made it clear. She set down her fork. She did not do it dramatically. She set it down the way you set something down when you are finished with it. Then she looked at her eldest son. She said, "Colin." The table heard it, the tone. Not accusing. Something flatter and more serious than accusing. The tone of someone who has arrived at a point they have been traveling toward for 10 days and has arrived precisely. Colin said, "Mom, what is this?" Not a question. A deflection wrapped in the shape of a question. I recognized it professionally and personally. I said, "It's a documented record of withdrawals made from Mom's accounts using the power of attorney she signed in the 4 weeks after Dad died." The table was fully quiet now. Ray put down his wine glass. Barbara looked at Ray. Bree's husband James looked at Bree, who was looking at her plate. Colin said, "Margot, this is not the place." I said, "You have been using Mom's accounts for 22 months, Colin. $187,000. This is exactly the place. This is her house. Her table. The people around this table have known this family for 40 years. This is the correct place." Colin looked at our mother. He said, "Mom, I can explain this. I was managing expenses. There were costs associated with managing the estate that weren't accounted for. I've kept track. I've been meaning to sit down with you and go through everything." My mother said quietly, "You have been meaning to sit down with me for 22 months, Colin." He said, "It's more complicated than it looks on paper." I said, "I'm a forensic accountant. It's not more complicated than it looks on paper." Dana, Colin's wife, said Colin. Her voice was flat and completely without surprise, which told me something I filed away. Ray said carefully, "Dennis." He meant my father. The name came out before he adjusted it. Frank. He cleared his throat. Frank kept those books himself for 40 years. The table was very still. Colin pushed back from the table. He said, "I'm not going to sit here and be ambushed at Easter dinner." My mother said, "Sit down, Colin." He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was not quite surprise, because she had said it before, sit down, in the 42 years of his life that had been shaped by her voice. But she had never said it with this quality, which was not anger, not pleading, which was simply the voice of a woman who has full information and a clear position and will not be moved from it. He sat down. My mother said, "You signed my name to things I didn't understand. You used money your father left me." She was looking at her eldest son son with the specific expression of a woman encountering a gap between the child she raised and the person sitting across from her. She said, "I need you to tell me why." The table waited. Colin was a man at a table where he had been loved for 42 years, with his wife beside him, with his father's oldest friends watching, with his sister's documentation in front of him, and no story that could reach the distance between what he had done and what he should have done. He opened his mouth, he closed it. He said, "The business was struggling." He said it to his hands. Last year, the year before, there were cash flow problems I didn't want to worry you with. I told myself I would pay it back when things stabilized. My mother said, "Did you intend to pay it back?" A longer pause. He said, "I thought I would have more time. Not yes, not a plan, time." Ray stood quietly and said, "Barbara." He helped his wife up. He said to my mother, "June, I'm going to call you tomorrow." His voice was careful and kind. He looked at Colin for a long moment, the look of a man who has known someone's father since before that someone was born and is doing a specific accounting right now of what the father would see in this room. Then he walked his wife to the door. Vivian followed. The other guests moved with the quiet speed of people leaving a place where something private is happening. I did not stop them. My mother did not stop them. Within 12 minutes, the table was down to family. Colin and Dana, Bree and James, Sophie and Ethan and Josh and Caleb, who were outside in the garden and did not know anything had changed. My mother looked at her eldest son. She said, "I want to understand what you thought you were doing." Colin talked for 20 minutes. I listened and I let him talk because listening was part of the accounting. He talked about the business and the cash flow and the decisions he had made and the logic that had felt sound at the time and the intention to rectify and the difficulty of bringing it up and the fear of disappointing her. He talked with the particular quality of a man who is not lying about having had reasons, who had reasons, they were just not adequate and he knew it and was trying to organize them in a way that would reach across the table to the woman who had trusted him. They did not reach across the table. When he stopped, my mother said, "I need you to leave now." He said, "Mom." She said, "I need you to leave my house. I will call you next week. I need you to leave now." Dana touched his arm. He stood. He said my mother's name one more time, the way people say a name when they are hoping the name itself will change what is happening, which it does not. My mother looked at the table. He walked out. Dana followed. The door closed. Bree was crying. Quietly, into a napkin, the specific crying of a person who is not surprised and is ashamed of not being surprised. She said, "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know this, but I knew something." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't I say anything?" I said, "What would you have said? You didn't have the information." She said, "I had a feeling." I said, "A feeling isn't a folder, Bree. You couldn't have done what I did without what I had." She wiped her eyes. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "Mom and I are going to talk to Patricia Hale. We're going to understand the legal options. As nothing is decided yet." She said, "I want to help." I said, "Then be here for Mom. Come when she calls. Pick up when she calls. That's the help that's needed right now." I stayed until 4 o'clock. I helped my mother clear the table. We washed the good china by hand, side by side at the sink, the way we had done it for as long as I could remember. My mother did not talk. She was in the specific quiet of a person who has done a necessary thing and is living in the immediately after of it, where the necessary thing is finished, but its full weight has not yet settled. She said at the sink, not looking at me, "Your father knew." I said, "Yes." She said, "He trusted you with it." I said, "Yes." She dried a plate. She put it carefully in the cabinet. She said, "Good." The consequences came in the weeks that followed in the way they come when truth is in the open, visibly, specifically, through channels that had been waiting for exactly this. Patricia Hale engaged a civil recovery attorney. The documentation I had compiled, transaction by transaction, dated, sourced, totaled, was the foundation of the legal file. Colin did not deny the withdrawals. He engaged his own attorney. By the end of April, there was a repayment agreement in negotiation, structured, documented, with terms that accounted for the full amount plus interest calculated from the date of the first withdrawal. The house renovation, the new truck, the business accounts. All of it was now a ledger my father could have read in 20 minutes. Dana called me on a Tuesday evening 6 weeks after Easter. I answered because I thought she might have information about the legal process. She did not have information about the legal process. She said, "I want you to know that I didn't know, not the full scope. I knew the business was struggling. I didn't know what he was doing to manage it. I need you to know that." I said, "I believe you." She said, "I'm angry at him. I want you to know that too." I said, "That's between you two." She said, "I know. I just needed to say it to someone." I said, "I hear you." Ray called my mother on the Monday after Easter as he had said he would. She told me about the call at our Wednesday dinner, which had become a standing practice in the weeks after. Wednesday evenings, dinner at her kitchen table, the two of us. She said Ray had cried on the phone. She said he had talked about my father for half an hour, the kind of talking about a person you do when you are very old friends and you have just encountered a piece of information that reorganizes some of what you thought you understood about how things were. He said, Frank would be devastated. Then he said, no, Frank would be proud of Margot. I think he would be devastated about Colin and proud of Margot. My mother said she had agreed with this. Bree came to Millhaven on a Saturday in May. She stayed for the weekend, which she had not done in 2 years, and she cooked dinner on Saturday night, which she had not done for my mother in longer than either of them could precisely remember. On Sunday morning, she sat with my mother at the kitchen table and went through the account statements with her, carefully, which was not a thing Bree had done before, and which required her to sit with information in the way she had always found uncomfortable, with patient precision. She did it anyway. She asked questions and waited for the answers. When she didn't understand something, she asked again rather than filling in the blank with an assumption. I know this because my mother told me about it at our Wednesday dinner the following week with the specific warmth of someone describing a pleasant surprise. Colin and I have not spoken since Easter. I want to be precise about this because people assume silence means permanence, and I am not prepared to make a statement about permanence. I have not spoken to my brother since I put a folder on my mother's Easter table and named what was in it. The repayment process is ongoing and managed through attorneys, and I am not part of those conversations directly. I do not know what Colin is thinking or feeling, or whether he is capable of accounting for what he did in a way that would mean something, which would require him to be a different person than he has been, which is possible but not something I can assess from here. I am not holding the door open. I am also not locking it. I am simply doing what my father's letter instructed me to do, dealing with it clearly and not apologizing for what dealing with it required. The repayment agreement was signed in June. The full amount, plus interest, to be repaid over 4 years in monthly installments to an account held in trust by Patricia Hale for my mother's benefit. Colin's wife Dana signed as co-guarantor, which told me something about the state of things in that household that I noted and filed without comment. My mother received a letter from Patricia when the agreement was executed. She read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening while I sat across from her. She read it twice. Then she put it on the table and looked at the window. She said, "Your father would have been satisfied with this." I said, "Yes, I think so." She said, "Not happy, satisfied." I said, "There's a difference." She said, "Yes." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. We sat like that for a moment, not talking, in the kitchen on Dunmore Road where she had made pot roast and Easter ham and 40 years of meals, in the house where my father had kept his ledger books on a specific shelf in a specific order and had made a phone call to his attorney 14 days before a diagnosis because he was Frank Ellen and he organized things, including the things he hoped would never be necessary. My father's ledger books are on the shelf in his study. My mother has not touched the study significantly since he died, which is her right and her pace and her business. The books are on the shelf in the correct order, green-covered, organized by year, from 1979 to the year he died, a row of annual decisions in his mechanical pencil. I go into the study sometimes when I am at the house, I stand at the shelf, I read the spines, I don't take them out. I know what is in them, I know how to read them. I know what the numbers would tell me if I did. On the last visit I made before writing this, I went into the study, and I stood at the shelf, and I looked at the books, and I thought about the phone call he had made to Patricia Hale 14 days before everything changed. I thought about what it cost to make that call. To acknowledge that the thing you hoped would never be necessary might be necessary. To set up the monitoring rather than the trust, which is not the same as distrust. It is the preparation of someone who understands that love and clarity are different instruments and both are required. He was right about me. I want to say that plainly because I think it needs to be said plainly. He called me the right person and he was right. Not because I am harder than my siblings. Not because I loved my mother more. Because I had the training and the temperament and the specific quality of attention that the situation required. And because when the folder landed in front of me, I did not look for a way not to see what was in it. I looked at what was in it and I named it and I put it on the table at Easter dinner in front of 14 people. And I would do it 100 times over, which is what I said at the beginning, which I meant then and mean now and will mean every time I think about it for the rest of my life. I am 38 years old. I am a forensic accountant at a firm city where my job is to read what actually happened versus what someone claims happened, which requires the same quality of attention my father was training in me before I had a name for it. I have my father's letter in my desk at home, folded along its original creases, in a drawer that also holds a photograph from the last Easter he was at the table, and a printed copy of the repayment agreement with Patricia's notary stamp at the bottom and my mother's signature above it, clear and precise, the signature of a woman who knows what she is signing. I ruined Easter. I want to be completely clear about what I mean when I say that. I did not ruin Easter because I wanted to. I ruined it because a table is not only a surface, it is a record. It holds the weight of every meal that happened at it and every person who sat at it and every decision that was made and not made in the room it occupies. My father sat at that table for 40 years. His oldest friends have been coming to that table since before I was born. My mother has been feeding people at that table for longer than Colin and Bree and I have been alive. Putting a folder on that table was not a small thing. I knew it wasn't a small thing. I did it anyway, because what my brother had done was not a small thing, and doing a small thing in response to it would have been an error of proportion. My father understood proportion. He kept ledgers because he understood that every number in a financial record is a choice someone made, and that choices require accounting, and accounting requires honesty about the full picture, even when the full picture is uncomfortable. I ruined Easter, and I would ruin it 100 times over because my mother is 68 years old and she should know what is in her own accounts. Because my father made a phone call to Patricia Hale before his diagnosis because he loved my mother and knew her capacity for trust and wanted to make sure that capacity couldn't be used against her. Because he named me specifically and trusted my judgment and was right to. Because the truth is not the problem. The truth is what is true. And dealing with it clearly, without apology, is the only thing that was ever going to reach the full distance between what had happened and what should have. My mother makes deviled eggs at 5 in the morning. She started before my father died because it was her practice, and she has continued because practices outlive the people who were there when they started, and that continuity is the point. She made them this year on a Saturday morning in April at 5 in the morning in her kitchen on Dunmore Road for the first Easter at that table since the folder. I was there this year, just the two of us and Bree's family, smaller, quieter, real in the way that small and quiet things are real. We set the table together the night before. We used the good china. We used the tablecloth she had used for 40 years, pressed the evening before, the way she has always pressed it. We put the food on the table at 1:30. We sat down, we ate. We talked about my father the way you talk about someone when you have been missing them long enough that the missing is a companion, rather than an emergency. We talked about Sophie, who is 8 now, and very serious about a project at school involving ecosystems, which mother described with the complete attention of a grandmother receiving information she will hold carefully. After the meal, Bree helped clear the table. She did not have to be asked. She loaded the dishwasher and washed the serving dishes by hand and put them in the cabinet without being told where they went because she had watched them go in that cabinet her whole life. She knew. She just needed to stop assuming that knowing was someone else's job. It was a quiet Easter. It was a good Easter. It was the Easter that came after the one I ruined, which made it possible in a way that the prior 40 never were, because the prior 40 were built on a foundation that included a structural problem I had not yet examined. And you cannot build soundly on a foundation with a structural problem. You can only build apparently soundly. And the difference between apparent soundness and actual soundness is everything when something heavy is eventually placed on it. I have one question for you before I go, and I mean this the way I mean every question I ask, which is that I actually want to know the answer. Have you ever been in possession of information that would hurt someone you love to hear and that would hurt them more not to hear, and had to decide which hurt was the right one? Not a situation someone else described to you, your own. Tell me in the comments. The full answer, not the short one. Because I think more people have sat with that specific weight than say so, and I want this to be the place where you can say so. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear that the truth is not the problem. The truth is what is true. And dealing with it clearly is the most loving thing available in the situations where love and clarity are both required. If you haven't subscribed yet, I would love to have you here for the next one. There's a link in the description to more stories like this. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next time.